Did you know that some of the First Nations and Indigenous tribes in Canada are threatening to go direct to China to do business with them if they don't get what they want from the Fed and the province? And China has been heavily lobbying the Indigenous. Did you also know that Mark Carney's response to that was federally giving them more title? They just gave Musqueam title to all of Vancouver, Lower Mainland, Richmond, Delta, New West, all over the place. So, in response to the British Columbia mess of UNDRIP and DRIPA, instead of Mark Carney helping that situation, he said, let them. We'll give them title of all these cities in the Lower Mainland. And then that actually makes it easier for them to do direct business with China. I have fact checked this. There are two components to today's episode. One is me showing you how I fact checked if this is actually possible. And then I'm going to read to you another article that just isn't getting enough attention that Sam Cooper from the Bureau wrote about the federal government getting in bed with China through the Indigenous. I know there's been grumblings about this for the last 6 or 8 months that there's so much more going on than we actually think to do with DRIPA and UNDRIP. In the end, I have to say, though, that I truly believe, whether it's in 10 years, in 20 years, or in 30 years, that the First Nations and the Indigenous are going to get screwed along with the rest of us. This United Nations agenda screams of no private property, communism, and BC is the testing ground through it, through a perfect person like David Eby. And also think about it. Mark Carney knows the mess that BC's in, and he just gave title to the most important parts of BC to a tiny, tiny, tiny population of one tribe. It's really important that you stay to watch the entire thing and listen to what I'm telling you and what I'm showing you so that you can actually see all the aspects of everything Sam Cooper's talking about. Me looking to make sure that it's true, that this gives the Indigenous far more rights to sell off our resources and to get in bed with China. And China has been heavily lobbying the Indigenous. There's no way that the federal government would give this tiny, tiny amount of population this much say in what happens unless there's a bigger picture. The Fed can say, we're going to allow you guys to do this. But in the end, with the way the law works, at any moment, the Fed can come in and override everything. So whether that happens in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I believe in my lifetime, we're going to see what the true agenda actually is. And there are some Indigenous that have been calling out that this is a recipe to actually screw all the Indigenous, all the property owners, and we're going to be the test run for no private property here in British Columbia. Just think about this. No other country is doing this. The United Nations asked other countries to do it. They looked at it, they took it into consideration, and no other country is implementing this into law because they know exactly how this is going to end up. But British Columbia did it through woke and really, really stupid David Eby. So let's get into the episode. And like I said, if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, come back to it later because, especially in Sam's article, he gets to different aspects of how this is all coming together. And if you've already read Sam Cooper's article about this, I also show you in the first part, in the DRIPA document, how with this whole thing, when David Eby says, oh, no, it's all in consultation, everything's going to be group decision making. Well, not according to AI that looked through the whole document. It says that Indigenous have the power to say what's going from the bottom up, but the province does not have say from the top down. By law, it flows bottom up and not top down. So it's all a tap dance, it's all theater. David Eby is setting this up. Don't forget, he denied knowing what Mark Carney was about to do to BC, but he was busted. They said, what are you talking about? You knew all about it. You were there. He was sold out, I believe, by his own NDP. So there is something massive going on. We all knew it. Ron Valent was right. This is not going to end well for property owners. I don't think we're going to see property ownership affected right away, but it will eventually. 100%, mark my words, this will happen, and probably before I'm dead. Okay, let's get into it. Beijing's two-state strategy targets Indigenous land claims and resources to undermine Canada's national sovereignty, and Mark Carney's PRC pivot makes it more dangerous. Keep in mind, the British Columbia bans claimed that more than 100% of BC is theirs because of overlapping claims. If all of this goes through, we now have China entering BC through our Indigenous. And Sam Cooper, it talks about that here, but let me quickly show you this first. Oh, yes, and before I forget, guys, get your gold and silver at the dip. You're going to kick yourself if you don't. Get it at the dip before it skyrockets. libertytalkcanada.ca/gold. It goes to the Awake guys at New World Precious Metals. Tell them Odessa sent you. libertytalkcanada.ca/gold. Okay, I started using Google and then it was easier just to go to AI because it grabbed a whole bunch of websites and articles. So I said, so DRIPA may allow BC Indigenous to give China access to natural resources. That was my question. It responds, yes, DRIPA can facilitate BC First Nations' ability to negotiate and grant access to natural resources on their traditional territories, including with Chinese or other foreign investors, by strengthening their decision-making authority. So greater Indigenous control through DRIPA means the First Nations can more effectively approve, partner in with China, or block resource projects. They can negotiate equity stakes, revenue sharing, or direct deals with investors, including Chinese firms, without the province overriding them as easily. So, guys, this is the can of worms that is being opened. Now, do you want to hear something completely insane? So I asked, okay, but do the Indigenous not have to consult the province or federal government as well? So reverse of what you just said, because David Eby and them are saying it's all consultation, we're working together. Nope. It says no, it is not symmetric or reversed. The legal duty to consult flows one way from the Crown, federal and provincial governments, down to Indigenous groups. Indigenous nations do not have a comparable, formal legal obligation to consult the province or federal government before making decisions on their own lands, treaties, or impact benefit agreements. And guys, Mark Carney just gave title to most of Vancouver Lower Mainland. So that's the one that David Eby said he didn't know anything about, but he was caught lying because they're like, dude, you were there. And you guys might say, well, it's only, on the land that they've been given. Completely, I understand that. But they're claiming that the whole province belongs to them. So this can get very hairy very quickly. And I don't understand why Mark Carney just gave title to where I live, Vancouver. I think it was Richmond. It's just basically, you have to look it up. In fact, I think I might cover it in this episode. Yeah, actually, Sam Cooper covers exactly where, but they've just given title there as well. The Fed, not just Ebby. So this is flowing one way. They're giving them the right to block projects, but also they don't have to consult the province or the Fed, according to AI here, Grok, when it looked at the agreement. Critics argue DRIPA creates opportunities for direct nation-to-nation style deals with foreign entities, potentially bypassing broader federal and Canadian oversight on our critical minerals, LNG or timber. Sovereignty concerns have been raised about fragmentation, where stronger Indigenous title could enable external actors to gain influence via targeted partnerships. In short, DRIPA does empower BC Indigenous groups with stronger tools for resource governance and economic partnerships on their terms, including potentially with Chinese investors. So down here it says important caveats. DRIPA applies to provincial laws and decisions. Federal oversight example, exports, national security reviews under the Investment Canada Act, or trade agreements, still applies to foreign investments. But let's get into what Sam Cooper from the Bureau is talking about to do with Mark Carney, China, and the Indigenous, who will start wanting to do more and more business directly with China because of the amazing offers that China will start to do to have access to Canada's resources. And like I said, in BC, Indigenous are claiming title on the whole province.
I was indirectly referred to as a conspiracy theorist in the BC legislature yesterday. The government was questioned about the removal of the word provincial from the park signs, and their response was to dismiss the concerns as a conspiracy. And I want you to hear what they said.
Can the minister confirm that this NDP government has a policy to remove and replace signs that say provincial at BC's provincial parks?
I think that the members opposite have been reading too many conspiracy theories. Our parks are provincial and we're proud of it. There is absolutely no initiative to remove provincial from park names or signs. The Cypress Park sign was replaced because it was over 50 years old and was rotting through. The new sign includes a BC Parks logo to make clear that the park is provincial.
Now, I will be the very first person to tell you if I am wrong or I have made a mistake. But after hearing this, I went back to the research. The government's defense is that they are not removing provincial identity. They say that they're just using a BC Parks logo instead of the word provincial. Technically, sure, the logo is there, but a logo doesn't say provincial. A logo is a brand that can be changed or phased out at any time. And if you think that I'm nitpicking, go and head over to the official BC Parks website. I typed in park after park, Cypress, Joffrey. Guess what? None of them say provincial anymore. Then I typed the word provincial into their own search bar, and guess what? 0 results. In a system of hundreds of provincial parks, the word provincial has been completely scrubbed. But why? I'm so glad you asked. Look at their own commitment to inclusion. They officially state that the BC Park system is part of the province's colonial history. They've decided that the word provincial is an offensive colonial descriptor that does not reflect the reality of sovereign Indigenous territories. So from their perspective, these nations don't belong to a provincial territory. They predate it. So the word has to be inclusive. They've even issued a writing guide telling staff to stop using the term British Columbians for the exact same reason, because they've decided it is exclusionary too. Stop calling yourselves British Columbians and call yourself people living in BC. Oh, and I also found their Indigenous renaming checklist. They have a literal how-to guide to change the name of the parks. And they've already started that swap. John Dean Provincial Park is now Boyle Lake Provincial Park. Do you notice the pattern? In every single one of the official renames, the word provincial was the very first thing deleted, and technically the only thing deleted. They are spending $16,000 per sign to remove the name provincial from your public land, while simultaneously hiking up your camping fees to pay for it. They are clearing the legal path to rename these lands entirely, while telling you in Parliament that nothing is happening and you're a conspiracy theorist. That is the definition of gaslighting, my friends. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I just know how to read their own manuals. But let me know what you think in the comments. Is this inclusion or is it a disappearing act?
So that means if title goes to the entire province over the next coming years, then this 5% will start making deals with China and other countries. And that tiny, tiny population will also benefit economically much more than the rest of the British Columbians or the rest of the Canadians if it's in another province. Okay, so here's Sam Cooper's article. Please go to substack.com at Sam the Bureau to follow him on Substack. Sam tracks everything China. So at a moment when Canada is reassessing its economic sovereignty and Prime Minister Mark Carney is charting what he describes as a deeper strategic partnership with China, a long-running but poorly understood vulnerability is quietly advancing, one that cuts across the most sensitive fault lines in Canadian public life: Indigenous land rights, natural resource development, and Beijing's patient, methodical campaign to secure the commodities it needs without ever having to negotiate with Ottawa. The strategy, as intelligence documents obtained exclusively by the Bureau reveal, is not new. It is simply becoming more consequential. Canada's National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, in a top secret 2019 report obtained by the Bureau, found that Beijing was already targeting First Nations leaders through intelligence operations disguised as tourism. The goal, a People's Republic of China embassy official acknowledged in intercept reports reviewed by Canada's intelligence watchdog, was never cultural exchange. The tourism invitation extended to a national level group of Aboriginal leaders, the report says, was merely Beipian, Mandarin for to be fooled. The true purpose was to pursue Aboriginal controlled natural resources. Chinese intelligence, the report notes, conducted research on each delegate before they arrived, seeking to identify their potential usefulness. That is the covert face of Chinese resource strategy in Canada's north. But it has an overt companion pursued through British Columbia Indigenous business councils, Canada's most powerful pro-Beijing trade lobby and quickly evolving legal frameworks. China's overt power play, which seeks to leverage not only direct access to resource on lands claimed by Indigenous groups, but to rhetorically counter Canada's argument against Beijing's human rights abuses by citing Canada's own historical abuses against First Nations, and to do so in some cases at the behest of Canadian First Nations leaders themselves, is no less significant than any activities uncovered by Canadian intelligence. It is conducted in plain sight in Canadian courts and political offices and public forums, and it is moving quickly. For years, Indigenous organizations in BC have openly articulated a desire for direct, state-level relationships with Chinese mining and resource interests. Explicitly bypassing Ottawa, the First Nations Energy and Mining Council launched its First Nations and China Transforming Relationships strategy in 2011, establishing trade desks in Vancouver and China and dispatching a 10-day trade mission to Beijing that same year. The council was explicit: if the Canadian state was not adequately representing First Nations interests, First Nations would represent those interests themselves, including to Beijing. So this is the most important thing. Well, maybe not the most important, but what the First Nations are saying is, if BC doesn't give us what we want, we're going to go direct to China and make deals with them about our resources. And right now, as we know, there's heightened tensions. The First Nations are pissed. They want all of BC. A bunch of them do not like the white man, and they are mad now at David Eby yet again because they want as much control as possible. And so we're in a huge pickle here because of DRIPA, because we listened to the nightmare of UNDRIP, because we listened and now it's becoming law in BC. They didn't think this would happen. And now they're like, okay, well, if you guys don't give us what we want, we're going to extort you and go to China. Now, I'm not saying it's all bans and it's not all First Nations. There are some that don't want to develop resources because they care more about nature. But if we think we have problems with DRIPA now, just wait when they're trying to make direct deals with China and the Fed or the province puts up a fight, if they do. But let's read on about Mark Carney and the CHINAFICATIon of Canada. In his study, quote, Disrupting Canadian Sovereignty, the First Nations and China's Strategy Revisited, York University professor Jean-Michel Moncion examines, quote, the ways BC First Nations are engaging with Chinese investors and opposing the Canadian state, notably through the First Nations and China strategy, describing the council's role as reproducing a third space of sovereignty to resist the hegemonologue of state sovereignty in contemporary Canada-China relations. It is in Moncion's framing not merely an economic initiative, but a structural challenge to Canadian diplomatic authority over its own territory. The national security implications of that posture have not been lost on experts who have studied Beijing's methods closely. In a prior interview with the Bureau on Canadian Security Intelligence Service findings regarding the covert targeting of Indigenous leaders, Charles Burton, a former Canadian diplomat, said, quote, "The idea of making friends with Aboriginal people for Chinese strategic purposes would be part and parcel of their overall agenda to get access to the Canadian North and the natural resources that are there," unquote. The rhetorical dimension of Beijing's strategy is, in some respects, the most audacious. As far back as 2012, the Yinkadeen Alliance, a coalition of 6 BC First Nations, sent an open letter to then Chinese President Hu Jintao asking him to raise Canada's human rights record regarding Indigenous peoples with Prime Minister Stephen Harper during an official visit. The letter handed Beijing precisely the instrument it prizes most, a Canadian voice making Canada's case against Canada at the highest levels of international diplomacy. So what's going on is basically when people are raising a stink in Canada saying, wait a sec, the Indigenous are all about human rights violations, the residential schools, claims this happened, claims that happened. So what they're saying is, hey, well, you guys abused us years ago here in Canada. So they go to China to say, hey, leader of China, if we get any pushback, because the Indigenous tribes can make a ton of money off China selling the resources, if we get any pushback saying, hey, I thought you guys were all about human rights violations, why are you dealing with China, who is like the worst human rights violations around? Then they're going to say, well, you guys did it to us, so, it's square. We're even. They want the Chinese leader to publicly throw it in Canada's face. Well, you guys had residential schools. So these Indigenous leaders, the ones that want to get involved with China, are literally asking China to bash Canada publicly so that there isn't pushback that they're going to get into bed with China. Do you see what I'm saying? So it says here, it was in miniature a preview of the broader dynamic that Chinese influence strategists have since worked to cultivate and expand, one that would find full expression nearly a decade later on the floor of the Canadian Senate. In June 2021, guys, basically, these particular First Nations leaders are asking China to lobby against Canada publicly so that they can do deals. This is insane. China, communist, what they do to their Uyghurs and what they do to people and their genocide. Oh my gosh. And they're still doing it. Unbelievable. So anyways, yes, it says right here in June 2021, BC Senator, I'm not sure how to say this properly, Wan Pao Wu, rose to oppose a motion that would have recognized Beijing's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as genocide. Invoking Canada's residential school system, Wu told the Senate that Canada, quote, did all those things, and we did them throughout our short history as a country, most appallingly to Indigenous peoples. The motion was defeated. China's foreign ministry promptly praised the senators who voted it down as, quote, people of vision, unquote, who had seen through, quote, the despicable schemes of a few anti-China forces, unquote. The narrative of shared historical grievance has found willing amplifiers in Canada. And again, this is what they're doing. They're doing all this propaganda so that we as Canadians say, yeah, go ahead, do direct deals with China, come and take our resources. And so continuing, the Canada-China Business Council's 2022 Denton's report, which encourages direct China to Indigenous resource dealings, explicitly invokes it, asserting that Chinese and Indigenous Canadians share a history of marginalization and cultural similarities, and that there's evidence Chinese explorers first interacted with Indigenous communities on the coast of BC hundreds of years before contact with Europeans. A contested historical claim, adding that instead of colonization, there was mutual trade and respect. The Musqueam Nation in Vancouver does have a documented history of Chinese Indigenous relations rooted in Chinese market gardens who lived and farmed on Musqueam Reserve land in the early 20th century. Under BC Premier David Eby, the pace of Indigenous land title recognition and rights expansion has accelerated dramatically. The provincial government's implementation of the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, combined with a series of landmark court decisions confirming Aboriginal title over specific territories, has rapidly altered the legal landscape governing resource extraction in Western Canada. More land is now subject to Indigenous control. More projects require Indigenous consent. These are, in principle, corrections to historical wrongs, but they also mean that the pathway to Canada's most strategically valuable resources, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, timber, and liquefied natural gas, now runs, in many cases, directly through First Nations governments. Beijing, acutely interested in North American court procedures, has obviously noticed. So, in BC, the Indigenous want the entire province. So this is no small thing. And I did go into asking through AI, would this mean that the small population of each tribe that deals with China and making a ton of money off these deals, would those people benefit much more than everybody else in the province sort of equally? And yes, and this is a big issue that's been brought up, that this tiny percentage of people, so it's 5% of the province claim, because it's self-proclamation, to be Indigenous. But even AI agrees, if you ask it, that really only about 3.5% are full Indigenous. Okay, so that's fine. There's mixed as well. There's Métis, etc. So yes, the huge issue is that a very tiny amount of people in BC would be benefiting from these massive sell-offs of our resources. So they can also block what they want to block, and they can also get into bed with China if they want as well. And because Carney is more and more into China, this can become a huge issue quickly. So he goes on to say here that, as we know, in Feb 2026, when the Musqueam Indian Band and the Fed government signed 3 landmark agreements recognizing Musqueam Aboriginal rights, including title. So the federal government, Mark Carney's Liberal government, has just done more to push this forward. So that's what Sam Cooper's talking about. So we've got the BC thing happening, and then we have the Fed. The federal government, nothing to do with Eby, although Eby did know about it, is recognizing Musqueam Aboriginal rights, including title, spanning much of Metro Vancouver, Richmond, Burnaby, parts of Delta, North Vancouver, West Vancouver, the University of British Columbia campus, Coquitlam, New West, Surrey, and the land beneath Vancouver International Airport. Basically all the lower mainland here. The agreement, which was secretly negotiated and presented as a done deal with zero public knowledge or input, covers the most strategically critical infrastructure in Canada. And this is where I live, Vancouver, including the Port of Vancouver, the country's largest and busiest port, and a long-standing focus on the Bureau's reporting on Chinese transnational organized crime and Belt and Road Initiative maritime penetration. Guys, this is so important what he's talking about here. Even Premier Eby, who attended the signing ceremony, claimed afterward that he had no line of sight on the agreement. So Carney hands everything to the Indigenous. Eby pretended he didn't know about it, but then he got caught. He did know about it. So now we have a Fed and BC issue here happening. Moving on, the Canada-China Business Council, a trade lobby with deep roots inside the Liberal Party of Canada, whose leadership has over the years included figures with close proximity to multiple prime ministers, published a report in March 2022, co-produced with Dentons, explicitly advising Indigenous businesses on how to enter the Chinese market, attract Chinese investment capital, and build direct relationships with Chinese state linked enterprises. The Dentons connection carries its own weight. Former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien joined Dentons as counsel in February 2014, where he has worked since. Chrétien's ties to the Canada-China Business Council runs deeper still. Paul Desmarais Sr. founded the Canada-China Business Council in 1978, and Chrétien's daughter is married to Desmarais' son, André, if I'm not saying it right, sorry. A familial bond that has long placed Chrétien at the intersection of Canada's most powerful pro-Beijing commercial network. A member of the Desmarais family continues to chair the Canada-China Business Council today. In his writings on Chinese influence operations in Canada, scholar Dennis Molareno has described Chrétien as an old friend of China and linked the council to Beijing's broader soft power apparatus, including the United Front Work Department. The council's advice to First Nations leaders, read against the intelligence picture obtained by the Bureau, takes on a different character, perhaps not merely commercial guidance, but plausibly an elite channel through which Beijing's resource interests might be advanced at arm's length from Ottawa. Mark Carney's government has spoken of strategic partnerships and economic engagement with China as though the principal risk to be managed is the tariff environment. That is simplistic. The deeper risk is that Canada's critical mineral wealth, the very resources that Carney has identified as central to Canadian economic sovereignty in a multipolar world, could be traded away through channels that Ottawa has limited control over. Canada's public has not yet recognized or reckoned seriously with the fact that Beijing seeks to negotiate directly with Indigenous peoples worldwide, from Australia to Taiwan, seeking to undermine democratic sovereignty. And this strategy has gathered alarming pace in Mark Carney's Canada by the Bureau. Again, thank you to Sam Cooper. Please go follow his Substack at Sam the Bureau. So those people that say, oh my gosh, Canada's not being sold off to China, well, they've set up ways in which that can happen. And right now, everything seems to be about money. It's show me the money. So if China's going to show First Nations the money, certain First Nations or Indigenous leaders will take it. Some won't, but some will. So let's come back in 10 years and actually see what happens, shall we? I'm Odessa Orlowitz. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you at the next one. Did you know if the banks do a bail-in, they can take the contents in your bank vault? But storing your gold and silver at home could be a huge security risk. Every day, our dollar is worth less and less. Inflation is stealing the only savings families have. Now more than ever, it's so important to hedge the savings you've worked so hard for. Banks have been failing all over the world, and social credit has all but arrived. But did you know you can do wholesale price vaulting and retail delivery from the most prestigious, reliable company in Canada? Did you also know if you decide to leave Canada, your gold and silver can be sent right to you after you arrive to your destination? The only company I personally use and trust are those awake guys at New World Precious Metals. Take control of your family's future. You can just click the link in my show description or type in the web address libertytalkcanada.ca/gold to get on their mailing list, attend their webinar, or book an appointment. Let them know Odessa sent you.
Restore Effects is the leader in professional paintless clear coat repair. Perfected over 2 decades, our product system surpasses traditional clear coat fixes to pave the future of vehicle reconditioning. Restore Effects permanently removes 99% of damage to your clear coat by replicating and restoring the original paint finish. Reset your vehicle's appearance or put your business fleet's best foot forward, all without repainting. Visit restoreeffects.com and find a center near you.